Psychiatry, at its absolute core, is, well, it's the study of how the brain, the mind, and experience all interact. And crucially, how that entire process can go wrong.
Right, which is quite a broad mandate when you really think about it.
It is, yeah. And, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis in other fields, there is this expectation of, like, mechanical precision.
Absolutely. A clear cause and effect.
Exactly. I mean, if a patient breaks their arm, the radiologist puts up the x-ray, points to that jagged white line on the radius and says, there is the problem. The injury is a distinct object, and the patient is the subject observing it.
Right, it's out there. It's measurable.
But when you turn that diagnostic lens inward onto the very entity that is actually doing the looking, the entire foundation of how we define a thing begins to blur quite a bit.
It does. It creates a really profound epistemological problem because we are essentially using the instrument to measure the instrument.
Which is maddening if you think about it too long.
It really is.
So to help you, the listener, visualize this, I want you to imagine sitting in a grand concert hall. On the stage is a full symphony orchestra, and they're playing the most beautiful, unified piece of music you have ever heard.
Okay, setting the scene.
You sit in the audience, and you experience it as a single, cohesive wave of sound just washing over you. The strings, the brass, the percussion, they all just meld into one entity. But if you look closely at the stage, you notice something impossible.
Which is?
There is no conductor, there's no central figure standing on a podium coordinating the timing, directing the violins, or, cueing the brass.
Right, which, I mean, in a physical orchestra, that would result in absolute cacophony within about 2 minutes.
Total chaos, just noise. Yet we walk around every single day feeling like that beautifully unified piece of music. We feel like this single, solid pearl resting inside the oyster of our skull, and we call that pearl eye.
We do. It feels incredibly real.
But the biological reality is that we are the orchestra without a conductor. We are this massively distributed network of dozens of distinct biological instruments playing together across billions of synapses. And when those neural instruments fall out of sync, the self doesn't just get confused, it actively fragments.
Yeah, and that fragmentation is the terrifying but also illuminating reality of neuropsychiatry.
It's what we're going to unpack today, isn't it?
Exactly. The radical premise we are navigating in this deep dive is that the intuitive idea of a material self sitting inside the brain like, a little pilot flying a meat suit is fundamentally an illusion.
A very convincing illusion.
Oh, incredibly convincing. But the reality is that the brain actively, continuously constructs this I from moment to moment.
I was reading through the Neuropsychiatry of Self chapter recently. This is by Vago, Gusnard, and Silverswag in Kaplan and Sadok's comprehensive textbook of psychiatry. And I have to say, it completely shattered how I view my own identity.
It's a heavy chapter.
It really is. The authors do this incredible job of bridging the philosophical, the developmental, and the hard neurobiological hardware. So I want to be clear with you listening. We are not just going to list off brain regions or recite a glossary of terms today.
No, that wouldn't be very useful.
Right. Our goal here is conceptual synthesis. We need to build robust mental models, clarify the physiological mechanisms behind human experience, and ultimately strengthen how we approach clinical reasoning.
Because, simply put, if we don't understand the architecture of who the patient thinks they are, we cannot treat them when that architecture collapses.
Spot on. So a vital starting point here is addressing the historical baggage we carry. I mean, if the self isn't a single static object located in a specific cubic centimeter of brain tissue, how on earth did Western medicine get so thoroughly trapped into thinking it was?
Well, to answer that, we have to look at the philosophical clash that defines centuries of thought. On one side, dominating the Western intellectual tradition, you have the substantialist theories. And the titan here, of course, is René Descartes in the 17th century.
Right. I think, therefore I am. It's probably the most famous philosophical declaration in history. And honestly, it feels incredibly intuitive.
It does.
When I'm sitting alone in a room, just thinking about my day, there feels like a very definite me doing the thinking.
It feels intuitive because our brains actually evolved to create that exact sensation of unity. But Descartes codified this feeling into a strict dualism.
The famous Cartesian dualism.
Exactly. He argued for a fundamental separation between the res cogitans, which is the immaterial thinking mind or soul, and the res extensa, the material physical body.
So they are two completely different substances.
Right. In Cartesian dualism, the self is a substance. It's a real, indivisible entity that somehow interacts with the mechanical body. And Descartes famously, in somewhat bizarrely, speculated that this interaction happened in the pineal gland.
The classic ghost in the machine concept. But from a modern neurobiological standpoint, that creates an insurmountable problem, doesn't it?
A massive problem.
Because if the mind is completely immaterial, if it has no mass, no physical properties, how on earth does it cause a physical neuron to fire? I mean, how does a ghost push a physical lever?
It can't. And that is known as the interaction problem. It's exactly why dualism is a dead end for modern neuroscience. You just can't reconcile it.
Right.
But it's important to note that long before Descartes, entirely different paradigms existed elsewhere. The non-substantialist theories, which are deeply rooted in Buddhist and Vedic traditions, posited something very different.
What was their take?
They argued that identifying with a permanent material substance as the self is not just factually incorrect, it's actually the root cause of human psychological suffering.
Wow.
Yeah. They argued for a non-dual, impermanent, ever-shifting nature of consciousness. There is no permanent pearl in the oyster.
And it took a remarkably long time for Western philosophy to catch up to that concept, didn't it? You don't really see a major Western challenge to Descartes until David Hume comes along in the 18th century.
Yes, Hume was brilliant in this regard.
He essentially said, wait a minute, let's actually look for this solid self.
He employed what we'd call radical empiricism. Hume proposed the bundle theory of the self. He wrote that whenever he introspected, whenever he tried to catch a glimpse of this core I, he only ever stumbled upon a specific perception.
Like what?
Like heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred. He said he could never catch the self without a perception, and he could never observe anything but the perception.
So we are just the perceptions.
Exactly. He concluded that humans are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions, succeeding each other with inconceivable rapidity in a perpetual flux and movement.
I always think of Hume's observation when people try mindfulness meditation for the first time.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
Right. You sit down on a cushion, you close your eyes, and you think, okay, I am going to observe my core self now. And within like 10 seconds, you realize there is no CEO sitting at a desk in your head.
None at all.
There is just an itchy sensation on your nose, followed by a random memory of an embarrassing conversation from a decade ago, followed by a sudden intense craving for a sandwich. It is just a stream of phenomena.
And that stream of phenomena can feel incredibly chaotic, which is why early psychology needed a framework to categorize the different flavors of this experience. We needed to map it out.
Enter William James.
Enter William James, often called the father of American psychology. In the late 19th century, he provided a conceptual split that we actually still rely on today in psychiatry. He divided the self into two interrelated aspects.
Okay, what are they?
The self is subject and the self is object.
Or, as it's often referred to, the I self and the me self.
Precisely. The I self is the active experiencer. It's the raw sense of agency, the feeling that your body's movements belong to you. It's your immediate awareness of your internal physiological states.
It's the thing doing the looking.
Right. And importantly, the I self provides that baseline feeling of temporal continuity. It is the background hum that assures you that you are the same continuous organism today as you were when you went to sleep last night.
Got it. So if the I self is the camera lens taking in the world, the me self must be the photograph that the camera produces.
That's a highly effective analogy, yes. The me self is the self as an object of knowledge. It's what you know about yourself.
And James broke this photograph down further, didn't he?
He did, into three components. First, the material me, your body, your clothes, your home. Second, the social me, the recognition you receive from your peers, your reputation, the roles you play as a parent, a doctor, or a friend.
And the third?
The spiritual me. This refers to your inner, subjective being, your morals, and your intellectual faculties. So the me self is essentially the aggregate narrative of everything you believe about who you are.
But nobody is born with a fully formed me self photograph in their pocket. A newborn infant doesn't have a narrative about their reputation or their intellectual faculties. How does this architecture actually get built from scratch?
It's a layered developmental construction, and it is heavily dependent on interaction with the environment. It doesn't just happen in a vacuum.
Right.
If we observe infants between, say, 0 and 2 months of age, we see that their visual fixation is genetically primed to lock onto faces, specifically caregiver faces.
Which is an amazing survival mechanism.
Absolutely. At this stage, they are entirely governed by the I self. They are experiencing raw interoceptive signals, hunger, cold, warmth, but they are simultaneously building the most fundamental boundary of all.
The boundary between self and other.
Yes, they are figuring out where their physical body ends and the rest of the universe begins.
So when does the narrative part kick in? The me-self?
By the time a child reaches 2 to 4 years of age, that jimijin me-self really begins to articulate itself. The child develops language, which is crucial, and they start assigning physical and social attributes to their identity.
So they'll say things like, I have brown hair, or I am a fast runner.
Or, I am a happy boy. Yes. But it's very basic.
I have a young niece right in that age bracket, and what really fascinates me is how absolute her self-descriptions are. There is just zero nuance.
That's very typical.
If she is upset because she dropped her ice cream, her entire identity in that moment is, I am sad. She cannot conceptualize that she is generally a happy kid who is just experiencing a momentary setback.
And that binary thinking is a direct result of the limitations of their developing neuroanatomy, specifically the working memory capacity within the prefrontal cortex.
So it's a hardware limitation.
Entirely. A 3-year-old simply cannot hold opposing attributes simultaneously in their working memory. They cannot be both a good kid and someone who just did a bad thing. It's all or nothing.
When does that nuance finally arrive?
It isn't until middle childhood, roughly between ages 7 and 9, that the cognitive architecture matures sufficiently. At that point, they can finally integrate positive and negative concepts into a cohesive, nuanced portrait of the self.
This gradual, environmentally dependent construction really sets the perfect stage for the psychoanalytic models.
Yep.
Sigmund Freud obviously gave us the tripartite model, the id, the ego, and the superego.
Yes, conceptualizing the self as a battleground of unconscious drives and societal constraints.
But I actually want to bypass Freud for a moment and look at Heinz Kohut because his framework of self-psychology feels incredibly relevant to modern clinical practice.
Kohut is essential here.
Kohut argued that we don't just build ourselves in a vacuum, we literally outsource the construction to other people.
Yes, Kohut introduced the concept of self-objects. And it's important to clarify, a self-object is not a physical object like a toy.
Right.
It is another person who is experienced subjectively as a functional part of the self. Kohut argued that an infant cannot regulate their own self-esteem or soothe their own anxieties. Their nervous system just can't do it yet.
So they need help.
They require caregivers to perform these functions for them, effectively acting as external psychological scaffolding while the internal structures are still being built.
And he defined 3 specific functions these caregivers need to provide, right? Mirroring, idealizing, and twinship.
Correct.
Yeah.
Let's define those clinically, as they are very important. Mirroring is when the caregiver reflects back the child's innate sense of vigor, greatness, and perfection.
Like when a toddler draws a chaotic scribble on a page and the parent displays genuine delight and puts it on the fridge.
Exactly. That mirroring builds the child's baseline self-worth and vitality. They feel seen and valued.
What about idealizing?
Idealizing occurs when the child needs a figure of infallible strength and calm to merge with during times of distress. If a child is terrified by a loud noise, an unbothered, soothing parent allows the child to literally borrow that calmness.
They lend their regulated nervous system to the child.
Beautifully put, yes. And finally, twinship, or alter ego. This is the fundamental human need to feel a sense of likeness and belonging to a community, to feel that you are among people similar to yourself.
So if those self-objects are absent, let's say a parent is severely depressed and simply cannot mirror the child's vitality, or the parent is abusive and therefore terrifying rather than calming, the scaffolding of the child's self is built with rotten timber.
That's a grim but accurate way to picture it. The self fails to cohere properly.
It leads to profound fragmentation and narcissistic vulnerability later in life. We also see the importance of these internalized representations in cognitive behavioral frameworks, don't we?
Very much so. Aaron Beck, the pioneer of cognitive behavioral therapy, introduced the concept of cognitive schemas, which parallels this nicely.
How do cognitive schemas differ from Kohut's self-objects?
Well, while Kohut focused on the relational origin of the self, the people building the scaffolding Beck focused on the structural output,
Okay.
the final product. Schemas are highly durable, reified structures of belief about ourselves and the world. And once they are formed, often based on early experiences with those very caregivers we just discussed, they become the lenses through which we interpret every subsequent event.
So if a patient develops a maladaptive schema stating, I am fundamentally worthless, that belief acts as a rigid, unyielding filter.
It creates a brutal self-fulfilling prophecy. If they get passed over for a promotion at work, the schema says, see, absolute proof that you are worthless.
And if someone compliments them?
The schema dismisses it entirely as a lie or a mistake, or people just being polite. The patient's memory, perception, and behavior are all biased to constantly feed and confirm the negative narrative.
It forms the absolute bedrock of depression and many personality pathologies.
It does.
Let me try to tie the developmental psychology and the biology together with an analogy here. Building a human self is kind of like building a house.
Okay, I'm listening.
The biology, the neural networks, the genetics, the synapses, that forms the concrete foundation and the timber framing of the house.
Wow.
But the interior decorating is entirely psychological. It is done by our social roles, the mirroring we receive from caregivers, and the cognitive schemas we develop over time.
I would agree with that framework. It's a very helpful way to separate the hardware from the software, so to speak.
Because you can have a perfectly sound biological frame, no lesions, normal neurotransmitter levels structurally intact. But if your cognitive schemas have painted all the interior walls black and boarded up the windows, your subjective experience of living inside that house is going to be agonizing.
A profoundly dark place to live. And that analogy perfectly highlights why modern neuroscience rigorously rejects the concept of the homunculus.
Ah, the homunculus, the little man in the brain.
Yes, the homunculus is a persistent, deeply intuitive fallacy. It is the assumption that somewhere inside the brain, there is a central viewing theater.
Like a control room.
Exactly. And a little person sits there watching the screens of our eyes, listening to the speakers of our ears, and pulling the physical levers of our motor cortex to make us move.
But clinically and philosophically, this explains absolutely nothing.
Nothing at all. Because if there is a little person inside your head directing things, who is inside the head of the little person directing them?
Right. You just end up with an infinite regress of smaller and smaller little men. It doesn't solve the problem of consciousness, it just shrinks it down and kicks it down the road.
Okay.
It is basically just Cartesian dualism in a modern trench coat.
That's exactly what it is. So instead of a homunculus, modern biological science views the self through the lens of autopoiesis.
Autopoiesis, that's a heavy term.
It is a crucial concept introduced by biologists Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela in the 1970s. The term literally translates to self-producing.
Okay, how does a biological organism produce a self?
Let's strip it right back. Think of a single living cell. A cell exists in a chaotic, entropic chemical environment. To survive, it must create a boundary, a lipid membrane that distinguishes what is inside the cell from what is outside.
Okay, so it builds a wall.
Yes, but furthermore, the chemical reactions happening inside the cell continuously regenerate the very membrane that bounds them. The system recursively interacts with its environment, taking in nutrients and expelling waste, purely to maintain its own viability and organizational structure.
It's a closed loop.
It is a circular, self-maintaining loop.
So the cell is constantly defining its own border. But how does that leap from a single cell's physical membrane to the vast complexity of human consciousness?
The human mind and body operate on the exact same autopoietic principle, just at an infinitely higher level of computational complexity. The brain is locked in a circular recursive relationship with the body and the environment.
Constantly updating.
Exactly. It constantly updates its internal models based on sensory feedback to keep the organism alive. The self isn't a physical object sitting in a control room. The self is the ongoing dynamic process of the organism continuously distinguishing me from not me in order to survive.
The philosopher Daniel Dennett famously called this the center of narrative gravity.
Yes, a very famous concept.
He argued the self is essentially a useful fiction. It's an abstraction, much like the center of gravity of an object isn't a physical atom you can point to and weigh, but it's a mathematical necessity to explain how the object behaves. But I have to push back on this concept of the self as fiction or a mere autopoietic illusion.
What is your contention?
Well, if the self is just an autopoietic process, if it isn't a real substantial thing, then why does it hurt so profoundly when Beck's negative schemas take hold?
I see where you're going.
If the self isn't real, how does a clinician treat an illusion that is causing genuine physical, agonizing depression? We see patients whose psychological pain is so severe, it manifests as physical catatonia. You can't just walk into a ward and tell a catatonic patient they are suffering from a narrative gravity error.
You are touching on the very crux of neuropsychiatry there. And you're right, the word illusion is perhaps too dismissive, too philosophical. It is better to say the self is a construction.
A construct.
Yes. The self may not be a substantial object, a physical pearl in the brain. But the process of self-representation is intensely real, it's metabolically expensive, and it's deeply biologically embedded.
So the emotional pain is real because the physical machinery generating the construction is real.
Precisely. Treating the patient means intervening in the dynamical systems that generate that construction. It means rewiring the cognitive schemas and altering the neural networks that have become rigidly locked into producing a narrative of suffering.
The output might be a narrative, but the engine is biological.
Exactly.
It is like a catastrophic software glitch. I mean, software isn't a physical object you can hold in your hand. You can't weigh a line of computer code. But if that code enters an endless, unresolvable loop, it will overheat the processor and crash the entire physical computer.
A very apt modern comparison. The software destroys the hardware.
And what I find fascinating is how historically dependent this software is on the physical environment and the tools we use. There is a detail in the source material regarding the 14th century glass industry that completely blew my mind.
Oh, the mirrors. It is a remarkable example of how external technology radically alters internal neurobiology and self-perception.
It's incredible. Prior to the widespread availability of high-quality silvered glass mirrors in Europe, which was around the 14th and 15th centuries, humans essentially never saw a clear, stable representation of their own faces.
It's hard for us to imagine now.
You might see a murky, distorted reflection in a pond, or maybe a dark shadow on a piece of polished bronze if you were wealthy, but a true, perfectly clear mirror simply did not exist for the average person.
And the psychological impact of sudden, high-definition self-visibility cannot be overstated.
Suddenly, you could stare into your own eyes with perfect clarity. It gave humans a stable representation of their physical me-self for the first time in evolutionary history. And historians actually argue that this technological leap spurred an absolute explosion in introspection, self-portraiture, and autobiography.
It literally catalyzed the Western concept of individualism.
The tool changed the software.
It forced the brain's autopoietic system to integrate a massive new stream of self-referential visual data. It had to update the model.
Which brings us perfectly to the actual hardware. We've talked about the psychology, the historical development, and the philosophy, but we need to look under the hood. What is actually happening in the biological hardware to generate these incredibly complex layers of the eye?
To understand the neurobiology, we really must ask an evolutionary question first. Why would a brain evolve a sense of self in the first place? Why go to all the metabolic trouble?
Well, plants don't have a sense of self.
Exactly, because plants do not move. The evolution of a central nervous system, and subsequently a sense of self, is fundamentally tied to locomotion. Mobile organisms must be able to predict the effects of their own physical actions on the environment.
Okay, give me an example.
If you turn your head to the left, your entire visual field sweeps to the right. Your brain needs an internal mechanism to know that you caused that change through your own motor action, and that the physical world itself isn't suddenly spinning out of control.
Right. If we lacked that mechanism every time we took a step forward, the brain would perceive the world rushing toward us like a terrifying earthquake. We would be completely paralyzed by sensory chaos.
Exactly. The foundational neuroscientist Antonio Damasio proposed that evolution solved this by creating a proto-self.
A proto-self, what does that consist of?
It is a highly rudimentary, preconscious neural mapping of the body's internal homeostatic states. It tracks the basics: blood pressure, oxygenation, temperature.
The deep maintenance stuff.
Yes. Layered onto that, as mammals evolved, Jack Panksepp described hardwired primal emotional circuits situated deep in the subcortical regions areas, like the amygdala and the hypothalamus.
So these ancient subcortical structures form the absolute baseline of subjectivity. They generate raw, unthinking feelings of fear, lust, or rage. But obviously, humans experience something much more complex than just a proto-self.
We do, because hominid evolution introduced intense evolutionary pressures for social complexity, group cooperation, and abstract reasoning. And these specific pressures drove a massive, disproportionate relative enlargement of the anterior frontal cortex.
We are talking specifically about the frontal polar cortex here, known anatomically as Brodmann Area 10, or BA10.
BA10 is proportionally much larger in humans than in other great apes. But it isn't just about size, it is fundamentally about the architecture.
How so?
BA10 features a uniquely lower density of neurons, which might sound bad, but it means there is greater horizontal spacing between the cells. And this extra space allows for incredibly complex, extensive dendritic branching.
Meaning the neurons in BA10 can reach out and connect with and integrate vastly more information from distant areas of the brain than a standard neuron could.
Precisely. It is the ultimate metacognition engine. It allows us to reflect on our own thoughts, hold prospective memories of the future, and achieve abstract, higher-order self-awareness.
This is brilliant. The authors of the textbook chapter, Vago and Silberswag, they systematize this hardware using the SART model, don't they?
Yes, the SART model outlines 4 distinct functional brain networks that are responsible for the ongoing process of selfing. And note the use of the verb selfing rather than the noun self. It is a deliberate nod to autopoiesis. We must explore these 4 networks, starting from the bottom up.
Let's break them down. The first layer is the enactive experiential self, or the EES. This sounds a lot like Damasio's proto-self in action.
Very much so. The EES is the deepest, most non-conscious layer of the self. Anatomically, it relies on the spinothalamo-cortical regions and the periaqueductal gray, or PAG, in the midbrain.
And what does it do?
The primary function of this network is the constant, unceasing monitoring of interoceptive feedback.
Interoception being the internal sensory signals. The feeling of your lungs expanding, the rhythm of your heart, the tension in your gut.
Yes. The EES orientates the physical organism in space and deciphers these non-conscious bodily states. It provides the primitive physical anchor for everything else. You rarely even notice it until something goes wrong.
Like the sudden visceral drop in your stomach when you miss a step on a staircase?
Exactly. That jolt is your EES reacting.
Okay, so the EES is the engine room, quietly keeping the physical ship running in the dark. What is the second network layered on top of that?
The experiential phenomenological self, the EPS.
Yeah?
This network shifts from the deep viscera to the surface of conscious experience. It involves the primary somatosensory cortex, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, DLPFC, and the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, DACC.
Okay, but what does the EPS actually feel like subjectively?
It is the immediate pre-reflective sense of being a subject experiencing the world right now. When you touch a hot mug of coffee and feel the immediate warmth, or you hear a sudden sharp noise and instinctively orient toward it, that is the EPS.
It's pure presence.
It is the feeling of alertness and pure presence in the moment, devoid of any complex narrative or historical baggage. It is raw data feed.
But human beings are notoriously terrible at staying in that raw data feed. We don't just feel the warmth of the coffee cup, we immediately start thinking about how we need to buy more coffee, which reminds us of the grocery store, which reminds us of an argument we had in the parking lot yesterday. We are absolutely addicted to the narrative.
Which leads us directly to the third and perhaps most heavily studied network, the narrative self, or NS.
And the engine behind the narrative self is the famous default mode network, the DMN.
The DMN is the orchestrator of our identity over time. Anatomically, it relies heavily on the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, VMPFC, the posterior cingulate cortex, PCC, and the hippocampus.
How does it operate compared to the EPS?
Well, when we are engaged in a demanding external cognitive task like solving a complex math equation or threading a needle, the DMN is largely suppressed. But the moment we stop, the moment we just sit on a bus and stare out the window, the DMN roars to life.
It thrives in mind-wandering. I've always thought of the DMN as an internal autobiographer who works 24/7 and just never stops typing. The VMPFC is constantly assigning emotional value to things, the hippocampus is feeding it memories, and the PCC is integrating it all together.
That's exactly what it's doing.
So you sit on that bus, and instead of just experiencing the phenomenological reality of the seat and the engine noise, the EPS, your DMN, plunges you into time travel. You are reliving a perceived slight from a coworker from 3 days ago, and then instantly projecting forward, rehearsing what you're going to say to your boss tomorrow to make yourself look good.
It stitches together the past and projects into the future to create a continuous, coherent story of you. It is the ultimate self-making network.
But wait, if we have these 3 powerful, distinct networks, the visceral EES, the present moment EPS, and the time-traveling NS, how do they not constantly overpower each other? There has to be a coordinator, right? Otherwise, we would be hopelessly fragmented.
There is a coordinator, and that forms the 4th pillar of the model, the frontoparietal control network, or the FPCN. This network, which includes the rostral frontopolar cortex and the anterior insular cortex, acts as the ultimate gateway and integrator.
It is the switchboard operator.
Exactly. The FPCN facilitates relational binding. It continuously toggles our attention between the internal ruminative narrative of the DMN and the immediate external sensory demands of the EPS.
So it decides what gets our attention.
Yes, it coordinates the data streams across all these resting state networks, ensuring that the biological orchestra actually produces a unified symphony instead of noise.
Which raises a terrifying clinical question. If the FBCN is the switchboard operator binding the self together, what happens when it drops the calls? Do we lose our life story, or do we lose the ability to tell the difference between our internal story and the external world?
When the FPCN or its integrating functions fail, we see profound psychiatric and neurological pathology. But to truly understand why those pathologies manifest the way they do, we have to look deeper at the basic computational algorithm the brain uses to separate self from non-self.
The core math of the brain.
Yes, and this algorithm is predictive coding.
This brings us to Carl Friston and the free energy principle. This is widely considered one of the most important concepts in modern neuroscience, the idea of the brain as a Bayesian inference engine.
It fundamentally changes how we view perception. Intuitively, we think of the brain as a passive receiver. We think our eyes act like video cameras feeding a live stream to a TV screen in the brain.
But that's not true.
No. The reality is that the brain is trapped inside a dark, silent bone vault. It has absolutely no direct access to the outside world. All it ever receives are ambiguous, noisy electrical signals from sensory organs.
So how does it construct a perfectly clear 3D reality from that noise?
It acts as a prediction engine. To survive, the brain uses its prior experiences and internal models to constantly generate predictions about what sensory inputs it expects to receive in the next millisecond. It pushes these predictions down to the sensory cortices.
Top-down processing.
Yes. It then compares its top-down prediction against the actual incoming bottom-up electrical data.
It is actively hallucinating a reality, projecting it downward, and then checking the math against the sensory feedback coming upward.
Exactly. The ultimate goal of the brain is to minimize surprise, which Friston defines computationally as free energy. Surprise is metabolically expensive and biologically dangerous. If the prediction perfectly matches the sensory input, the brain has successfully modeled the world, and it requires very little energy to process.
And if it doesn't match?
If there's a mismatch or prediction error, the brain must expend significant energy to update its internal models.
And the specific mechanism it uses to differentiate its own actions from the outside world within this framework is something called corollary discharge.
Corollary discharge is the absolute cornerstone of physical agency. When your motor cortex generates a command to, say, lift your arm, it doesn't just send that signal down the spinal cord to the muscles. It simultaneously sends a parallel feed-forward prediction, a copy of the command, to your sensory cortex.
It is essentially sending a memo to the sensory regions saying, hey, heads up, you are about to feel the sensation of the arm lifting and the fabric of the shirt moving. Don't be alarmed. I am the one causing it.
Because the resulting sensation is perfectly predicted by that internal memo, the brain actively attenuates the sensory feedback. It turns down the volume of the experience.
Why turn down the volume?
It does this so it doesn't waste metabolic energy processing its own expected movements, allowing it to remain highly sensitive to unexpected external stimuli, things that might eat you.
Which perfectly explains one of the most delightful and famous experiments in cognitive neuroscience, the Sarah Jane Blakemore tickling experiment. We finally have a hard neurobiological answer for why you cannot tickle yourself.
It is a flawless demonstration of corollary discharge in action. When you reach out to tickle your own ribs, your motor system sends the exact prediction of that movement to your somatosensory cortex.
So there's no surprise.
Right. The brain knows exactly when, where, and how hard the fingers will strike. The prediction perfectly matches the input, the signal is canceled out, and the ticklish sensation, which relies heavily on unpredictability and surprise, is completely neutralized.
But Blakemore proved it was entirely based on timing using a robotic arm, didn't she?
Yes, she designed a brilliant setup. Subjects would move a robotic interface with one hand, which would simultaneously operate a mechanical arm that tickled their other hand. When the movement and the resulting tickle were perfectly synchronous, the brain's corollary discharge worked perfectly. No tickle.
But then she introduced a delay.
A minuscule delay. She programmed the robotic arm to wait just 200 milliseconds after the subject's movement before actually delivering the tickle.
And what happened?
That tiny temporal gap meant the brain's feed-forward prediction arrived at the sensory cortex, but the sensory input didn't match it in time. The prediction expired. When the tickle finally arrived 200 milliseconds later, it registered as an unpredicted external event.
Wow.
The prediction error caused the sensation to bypass the cancellation mechanism, and the subject suddenly felt genuinely ticklish from their own indirect movement.
It is such a brilliant piece of experimental design. It proves that our profound philosophical sense of agency, the core feeling of "I did this," is actually highly fragile. It is entirely dependent on precise, millisecond perfect temporal matching between a prediction and a sensation.
And this mechanism extends far beyond simple physical touch. It scales up into complex social cognition, specifically theory of mind and empathy. Theory of mind is the cognitive capacity to attribute independent mental states, beliefs, intents, desires to other people, and to recognize that their mental states differ from our own.
Right. To navigate a complex social hierarchy, we have to constantly simulate what is happening in someone else's head, while rigorously maintaining the boundary that their thoughts are not our thoughts. We have to keep the self and the other strictly separate in the simulation.
Neuroimaging reveals a fascinating lateralization in how the brain handles this. The right inferior parietal lobe, or IPL, is heavily recruited during theory of mind tasks. It is dedicated to representing the mental states of others.
And the left side?
Conversely, the left IPL is much more involved in representing our own internal mental states.
We literally map ourselves and others on opposite sides of the parietal lobe to keep the data streams from crossing.
Yes, we spatialize it.
Yeah.
And we see similar complexity with empathy. Empathy is often misunderstood as just feeling sad when someone else is sad, but neurologically, it is much more demanding.
Let's unpack that.
Empathy requires a delicate, paradoxical balance. To be empathic, we must first share the experience. When you see someone get a paper cut, our brain activates regions like the anterior insular cortex, or AIC, essentially simulating the pain.
The AIC being the region where we map our own internal visceral states.
Correct. But if we only simulate the pain, we become overwhelmed by emotional contagion. We panic. To be truly empathic, to actually offer help, we must maintain separateness.
So we have to hold two truths at once.
We must simulate the other person's pain in our AIC, but simultaneously activate cognitive control networks to assert the boundary that it is their pain, not ours.
And evolution appears to have built a highly specialized piece of hardware to manage this exact type of rapid social and emotional processing. I'm talking about von Economo neurons.
Ah, yes. Also known as spindle neurons. They are a magnificent evolutionary adaptation. They are found almost exclusively in highly social, intelligent species capable of self-awareness: great apes, elephants, whales, and humans.
Where are they located in humans?
They are heavily concentrated in the anterior insular cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex.
What makes a von Economo neuron physically different from, say, a standard cortical neuron?
Most neurons in the cortex are pyramidal cells, which have a complex, highly branched dendritic tree for local, dense processing. Von Economo neurons, however, are spindle-shaped. They are very large, elongated cells with a single long apical dendrite and a single basal dendrite.
So they don't tangle with their neighbors as much.
Right. This streamlined morphology allows for exceptionally fast, long-distance conduction of electrical signals across the brain.
They are the fiber optic cables of the social brain.
Exactly. They provide rapid, high-bandwidth connections between the slow, complex cognitive processing of the frontal lobes and the deep, fast, homeostatic bodily states mapped in the insula. They are the biological bridges that allow us to instantly reflect on our own physiological, visceral responses to complex social situations.
So when this vast machinery is functioning, when the predictive coding matches, the corollary discharge cancels out our own actions, the FPCN integrates the networks, and the von Economo neurons rapidly process our social standing, we feel whole. We know what we are doing, we have a unified life story, and we know what others are feeling.
Yes, the symphony plays perfectly.
But this machinery is fragile. What does it look like clinically when specific modules of the system break down?
This brings us to the clinical pathology of the self, and it is where the fragility of the I becomes starkly, tragically visible. We must begin with schizophrenia. Emil Kraepelin, a foundational figure in early psychiatry, observed these patients and described their consciousness with a beautiful, haunting metaphor. He called it an orchestra without a conductor.
That is the exact metaphor we opened the show with.
Kraepelin, observing purely through clinical phenomenology long before fMRI even existed, saw profound disunity in the psychic personality. The cognitive faculties were intact, but their integration had completely collapsed. Today, we can finally understand some of the most bizarre and terrifying symptoms of schizophrenia, such as delusions of control and thought insertion, through the exact lens of failed predictive coding we just discussed.
Let's focus on thought insertion, because it is one of the most difficult symptoms for a layperson to comprehend. The patient presents with the absolute, unshakable delusion that alien thoughts, often malevolent ones, are being beamed or placed directly into their head by an external force, like the government or a supernatural entity.
To the patient, this is not a metaphor. It is their literal phenomenological reality. And we can trace it to a failure in the corollary discharge mechanism.
But how does corollary discharge apply to internal thoughts? We aren't moving a physical arm.
Inner speech and conscious thought rely on the same fundamental motor prediction architecture as physical movement. When healthy individuals generate a thought, the brain's cognitive generation centers send a feed-forward prediction, a corollary discharge, to the conscious workspace. It flags the incoming thought as self-generated.
It sends the memo. Expect to hear a voice in your head saying, "I need to buy milk, but don't worry, it's just us."
Precisely. But in schizophrenia, there is a systemic breakdown in these predictive signaling pathways. The brain generates the internal thought, but it fails to send the accompanying corollary discharge.
So the thought arrives in the conscious workspace entirely unpredicted.
The brain experiences a massive prediction error. And because the brain is a Bayesian inference engine trapped in a Duke box, it must explain this unpredicted sensory event.
It has to make sense of the noise.
If a voice suddenly appears in consciousness and there is no internal signal claiming ownership of that voice, the most logical, rational conclusion the brain can draw based on the faulty data is that the thought came from the outside. The hardware that flags a thought as mine is broken. The self-boundary is breached.
That is profound. The delusion isn't a psychological defense mechanism. It is a logical deduction made by a broken predictive engine.
Exactly.
We see similarly profound shifts in subjective experience with structural neurological syndromes. Consider the foundational case of Phineas Gage.
Gage is the bedrock case study of behavioral neurology. In 1848, he was a railroad construction foreman in Vermont. Due to an explosive accident, a large iron tamping rod was driven straight through his cheek, behind his eye, and out through the top of his skull.
Just a horrific injury.
It obliterated a significant portion of his ventromedial prefrontal cortex and orbitofrontal cortex, or OFC.
He miraculously survived the infection, and his basic intelligence, his memory, and his motor skills remained largely intact. But his physician and his friends famously noted that he was no longer Gage.
Prior to the accident, he was described as a shrewd, capable, well-balanced man. After the destruction of his OFC, he became fitful, irreverent, grossly profane, and utterly incapable of adhering to social plans or conventions. He lost his social and moral self.
The OFC is critical for evaluating social reward and punishment and regulating emotional impulses. When that hardware was physically removed, his capacity for social reasoning just evaporated. And what I find most revealing about Gage's case is what it tells us about how we as humans define identity.
How do you mean?
If a person suffers a stroke and loses their memory, or loses the use of a limb, their family still views them as fundamentally the same person. But if a brain injury alters their moral character, their empathy, or their social behavior, people feel the core self has been destroyed. We equate the I almost entirely with the social and moral modules.
Which perfectly illustrates that the self is an aggregate of modules, not a single substance. But if you want the ultimate proof of modularity, we must examine the split brain patients.
The split brain phenomenon is absolutely mind-bending. It forces us to question the singularity of consciousness itself.
In the 1960s, neuroscientist Roger Sperry and his colleague Michael Gazzaniga began studying a very unique cohort of patients. These individuals suffered from severe intractable epilepsy. To prevent the electrical storms from spreading across the entire brain, surgeons performed a corpus callosotomy.
They surgically severed the corpus callosum, which is the massive, thick bridge of hundreds of millions of white matter nerve fibers that connects the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere. They literally split the brain down the middle.
Functionally, yes. In everyday life, these patients appeared remarkably normal. But Sperry designed ingenious, highly controlled laboratory experiments to test them. The visual system is wired such that the right half of your visual field is processed by the left hemisphere of your brain, and the left visual field is processed by the right hemisphere.
And crucially, the primary language centers, Broca's and Wernicke's areas, are almost exclusively localized in the left hemisphere.
Sperry would seat the patient in front of a screen with a divider down the middle. He would briefly flash an image, say a picture of an apple, to the right visual field. The left hemisphere processes the image, and because the left hemisphere has language, the patient easily says, "I see an apple."
Normal so far.
But then, Sperry flashes a picture of a key to the left visual field. The image is processed exclusively by the right hemisphere. Because the corpus callosum is cut, the right hemisphere cannot send that visual data over to the left hemisphere's language center. When Sperry asks the patient what they saw, the speaking left hemisphere honestly replies, "I saw nothing."
The left hemisphere is genuinely blind to it.
But here is the critical part. Sperry then asked the patient to reach their left hand, which is controlled by the right hemisphere, under a partition to feel a pile of hidden objects. The left hand will flawlessly search through the objects and pick up the key.
The right hemisphere knows exactly what it saw. It understands the concept of a key, and it can execute a complex motor plan to retrieve it. It just cannot speak.
Exactly. Long-term observation of these patients revealed something staggering. Each disconnected hemisphere essentially possessed its own separate sensoromotor interface, its own memories, its own distinct problem-solving strategies, and even its own parallel personality.
That's wild.
The right hemisphere might like a piece of clothing that the left hemisphere dislikes. The split-brain experiments proved empirically that the normal, unified experience of consciousness is an illusion masking highly modular, parallel neural processes. Consciousness can be physically divided and remain functional. It is fundamentally dual.
Okay, I have to stop here and ask you to extrapolate, because this is where the philosophy gets genuinely uncomfortable. If severing a bundle of fibers reveals two distinct, parallel decision-making entities operating inside one skull, does that mean you and I are walking around with two distinct selves right now? Are we two people whose brains are just communicating across the corpus callosum so fast that we don't notice the seam?
It is perhaps the most profound question in cognitive neuroscience. The consensus leans toward the idea that we are a confederation of modules. In a healthy brain, the massive high-speed data transfer across the corpus callosum, coupled with intact subcritical connections in the brainstem and thalamus, forces these parallel modules to synchronize and present a unified, integrated output to the world. The FPCN integrates the streams. We are a unified coalition.
But the potential for multiplicity is biologically baked into us. We experience mild versions of this all the time. The subjective conflict when one module of your brain desperately wants to go to the gym and another module demands you stay on the couch and eat cake.
In a healthy brain, those modules negotiate. In a split-brain patient, that conflict can become starkly, violently literal.
Like the classic experiment where the patient is asked to perform a puzzle. The left hand, driven by the right hemisphere's superior spatial reasoning, starts assembling the blocks correctly. But the right hand, driven by the dominant left hemisphere, thinks it knows better and literally fights the left hand, slapping it away to try and take over the puzzle. It is two wills battling over one body.
That phenomenon is closely related to alien hand syndrome, another striking disorder of agency. In alien hand syndrome, typically caused by lesions to the medial frontal cortex or the corpus callosum, patients exhibit complex, seemingly purposeful movements with one hand that are entirely outside their conscious control.
The hand will reach out and grab a doorknob or start unbuttoning a shirt, and the patient has to use their other hand to physically restrain it.
Patients with parieto-occipital damage might exhibit avoidance, where the limb literally levitates away from surfaces. In both cases, the patient looks at their own arm with surprise, frustration, and absolute horror. They feel absolutely zero agency over the limb.
Because the predictive loops are broken.
Exactly. The action-execution module in the motor cortex is firing perfectly, but the intention and feed-forward prediction modules are disconnected. The hand belongs to the body, but not to the self.
And we see an even more extreme breakdown of body ownership in a condition called anosognosia, typically associated with unilateral spatial neglect.
Anosognosia is a profound deficit of self-awareness. It typically arises from massive stroke damage to the right parietal lobe. These patients often suffer from left-sided hemiplegia, complete paralysis of the left side of their body. But the defining feature of anosognosia is that they vehemently, genuinely deny that they are paralyzed.
If you ask them to move their left arm, what do?
They might invent an elaborate confabulation. They might say, "I don't feel like moving it right now, I'm tired." But even more bizarrely, if you pick up their paralyzed left arm and show it to them, they will deny ownership of the limb entirely.
They don't recognize their own arm.
They might claim the arm belongs to the doctor or to a relative sitting in the room. They have an isolated, structurally driven delusion denying their own physical boundary.
Yet, if you ask them where they grew up or what their occupation is, their memory is perfect. Their narrative self, driven by the DMN, is completely intact. But their inactive experiential self, the EES mapping the body schema, is fundamentally fractured. It proves you can knock out the ownership of arm module without touching the memory of childhood module.
We also see this systemic modularity break down in psychiatric conditions, specifically dissociative disorders like depersonalization and derealization.
This isn't structural damage from a stroke. This is functional disruption, often triggered by severe trauma or acute panic.
Yes. In depersonalization, a patient feels completely detached from their own physical body or their mental processes, as if they are an outside observer of their own life. In derealization, the external world feels foggy, dreamlike, or visually distorted.
What's happening in the brain during these states?
Neurologically, these states are associated with dysfunction and hyperinhibition in the temporoparietal junction, the TPJ, as well as the right frontoparietal networks.
The TPJ is a critical hub for integrating multisensory information, vision, touch, proprioception into a coherent body schema. When intense anxiety overloads that hub, the brain fails to integrate the somatic data. The subjective experience is one of profound, terrifying disconnection.
These are not merely cognitive errors or psychological metaphors. They are fundamental, measurable shift in the network dynamics of subjective experience.
All of these deficits, from thought insertion to the alien hand to depersonalization, show how incredibly fragile the I really is. It can be sliced, denied, or detached. But this raises the ultimate, unavoidable question of clinical reasoning. If the self is just a constructed output of the brain, a symphony of modules constantly updating biological predictions, do we actually have free will? And more importantly, for psychiatry, how do we harness these very networks to heal patients?
The question of free will is the elephant in the room whenever we discuss the neuroscience of the self. If we take a strict, reductionist scientific view, both our conscious thoughts and our physical actions are the downstream, inevitable results of prior, non-conscious brain activity.
Which brings us to the famous and still highly controversial experiment conducted by Benjamin Libet in the 1980s.
Libet sought to measure the precise timing of voluntary action. He hooked human subjects up to an EEG to monitor their motor cortex. He asked them to perform a very simple task: press a button or flex their wrist whenever they felt the spontaneous urge to do so. Crucially, he also asked them to watch a highly precise, rapidly moving clock and note the exact millisecond they became consciously aware of the intention to move.
So he is measuring three distinct things: the physical muscle movement, the conscious feeling of intention, and the electrical brain activity.
Exactly. And what Libet found was staggering. The EEG detected a readiness potential, a buildup of preparatory electrical activity in the supplementary motor area several hundred milliseconds before the subject reported feeling the conscious urge to move.
Let me make sure that is clear. The brain had already fired the neurons, made the decision to move, and started the engine long before the conscious self even knew what was happening.
That is the data. The motor action was initiated non-consciously. The conscious feeling of, I have decided to move my wrist, occurred almost as an afterthought shortly before the actual movement.
That is a deeply unsettling interpretation. It implies that the conscious I is just a PR representative taking credit for work the non-conscious brain already completed in the dark. It suggests we are biological automatons, and free will is just another autopoietic illusion.
That is the hard, deterministic interpretation, and it has caused decades of fierce debate. However, modern models of agency are much more nuanced than Libet's initial conclusions. We now look at frameworks like the comparator model proposed by Daniel Wolpert.
How does the comparator model rescue agency?
It suggests our sense of agency is largely retrospective. The brain generates a motor plan and a prediction. When the sensory feedback from the movement perfectly matches the prediction, the brain tags that event with a feeling of agency. We feel, I did that because the math checked out after the fact.
But that still sounds like taking credit after the fact.
Which is why researchers like Patrick Haggard argue that perspective signals also play a role. The early action selection and programming signals in the prefrontal cortex, the long-term planning modules, contribute to the feeling of agency. We may not have conscious control over the microsecond initiation of a muscle twitch, but our higher-order networks do exert inhibitory control and perspective planning. Agency is a complex interplay of perspective intention and retrospective matching.
So whether or not we possess absolute metaphysical free will in a philosophical sense, we definitively experience agency. And the critical point for psychiatry is that this experience of the self is malleable. It can become locked in rigid pathological states, but it can also be unlocked. How do psychiatrists alter this constructed self when it becomes diseased?
We are increasingly aiming for states of what researchers like David Yadin call self-transcendence. Yadin defines this as a complex phenomenon characterized by the transient dissolution of boundaries between the self and the other.
It sounds paradoxical. To heal the self, you have to temporarily dissolve it.
It is a shift from dualistic awareness, the rigid separation of subject versus object, me versus the hostile world, to non-dualistic awareness. This non-dual state is characterized by a profound sense of unity, connectedness, and intensely pro-social emotion.
We see this exact neurobiological shift heavily documented in contemplative practices, specifically advanced meditation.
Yes. Meditation training is not just relaxation. It fundamentally alters the architectural networks we've spent this hour discussing. It is a progressive structural intervention. It typically begins with neurovisceral integration, using focused attention on the breath to regulate autonomic tone, directly calming Damasio's proto-self and the inactive experiential self.
You are calming the midbrain engine room.
Then the practitioner moves to concentration practices, improving the inhibitory control of the frontal-parietal control network, FPCN. They learn to direct their attention at will. Finally, as practitioners deepen into non-dual and unified compassion practices, we see a distinct, measurable neural shift. Functional MRI studies, such as those conducted by Norman Farb, show that advanced mindfulness actively suppresses the default mode network.
It turns down the volume of the narrator. The autobiographer stops typing.
It's exactly. The rumination on past regrets and future anxiety ceases. Simultaneously, meditation significantly enhances the experiential phenomenological self, the EPS. The practitioner becomes fully present, acutely aware of the raw sensory data of the moment, but without the heavy judgmental burden of the autobiographical narrative.
This is exactly what third-wave cognitive behavioral therapies like acceptance and commitment therapy aim to achieve. They don't try to argue with the content of the negative thoughts. They teach patients to unhook from the narrative altogether. But meditation takes years of rigorous practice to achieve structural changes. There is another, much more rapid pharmacological intervention that is currently revolutionizing neuropsychiatry and our understanding of the self.
You're referring to psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy.
Psychedelics. It is a complete paradigm shift in how we approach treatment-resistant depression, PTSD, and end-of-life anxiety.
We are talking about classic tryptamine compounds like psilocybin, LSD, and DMT. These are profound tools for interrogating the neurobiology of the self. These compounds exert their radical effects primarily by acting as agonists at a specific receptor, the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor.
Let me stop you there because we need to get specific about the hardware. Where exactly are these 5-HT2A receptors, and why does activating them cause such a massive shift in consciousness?
These receptors are densely expressed on the apical dendrites of layer 5 pyramidal cells throughout the cortex. The cortex is organized in layers, and layer 5 contains the primary output neurons that send signals to other distant areas of the brain. When a psychedelic molecule binds to the 5-HT2A receptor on these specific cells, it triggers a cascade of intracellular events.
What happens to the cell?
It induces a massive, rapid increase in neuroplasticity. We see rapid dendritic arborization. The branching of the neurons physically expands to form new connections, and a surge in synapse formation. The brain enters a highly plastic, malleable state.
That explains the long-term changes. But what happens acutely during the trip? What happens to the SR2 networks we discussed?
On a macroscopic network level, psychedelics profoundly decrease the modularity of the brain. Normally, as we discussed, the default mode network and the frontoparietal control network operate within strict, rigid, segregated boundaries. They act as discipline modules. Under the influence of a classic psychedelic, those rigid boundaries completely dissolve. The networks undergo global high-entropy integration.
The snow globe gets violently shaken. Areas of the brain that haven't spoken to each other since childhood suddenly start communicating directly.
Yes, and Stanislav Grof, a pioneer in early psychedelic psychiatry, proposed that this temporary ego dissolution is the core psychodynamic therapeutic mechanism. Remember Beck's cognitive schemas, the deeply reified maladaptive loops that constantly tell a depressed patient, "I am worthless." Those schemas are maintained by the rigid connectivity of the DMN. When the DMN's grip relaxes under a psychedelic, those depressive loops are temporarily suspended.
The narrative gravity is turned off.
This window of high-entropy neuroplasticity allows the patient, critically guided by a trained therapist, to view their trauma or their identity from an entirely novel, non-egoic perspective. They can form new, healthier connections that persist long after the drug has left the system.
This brings up a crucial point for clinical distinction. because we have talked about losing the self in two very different ways today. How does a psychiatrist distinguish between pathological dissociation, like a trauma patient spacing out and experiencing terrifying depersonalization, and therapeutic self-transcendence achieved via meditation or psychedelics? Phenomenologically, if you ask the patient, both involve losing the boundary of the self.
It is a vital clinical question, and the difference lies in the network dynamics and the context. Pathological dissociation is typically a defensive involuntary mechanism. It is fragmentation driven by intense fear and amygdala activation, resulting in a fractured, inactive experiential self. The patient feels numb, unreal, and entirely disconnected from their agency. Their FPCN is failing to integrate sensory reality, isolating them.
It is a withdrawal from the world.
Conversely, therapeutic self-transcendence occurs in a context of safety, often with profound parasympathetic calmness and heightened awareness. The neural networks are not fracturing, they are hyper-integrating. The boundaries of the self dissolve not into numbness, but into an overwhelming, vivid sense of unity, connectedness to the environment, and pro-social compassion. The self isn't shattered into pieces, it is expanded to encompass the whole.
If we contrast a patient stuck in a depressive rumination loop with a patient undergoing successful psychedelic therapy, the difference is stark. In the depressed patient, the DMN is hyperactive, obsessively spinning a tragic narrative, completely disconnected from the present moment. In psychedelic therapy, that DMN rigidity melts. The brain enters a state of high entropy, allowing the control networks to reorganize the self-schema into something far more adaptive, expansive, and resilient.
That is the essence of modern neuropsychiatry. We cannot treat the brain merely as a bag of chemicals, and we cannot treat the mind merely as a collection of abstract thoughts. Psychiatry must engage with the first-person subjective experience just as rigorously as it engages with the third-person neurobiology. We are treating a dynamical, autopoietic system.
This has been an absolutely massive, intricate journey. To ensure we have firmly locked in these mental models, we need to distill the absolute key takeaways from the textbook chapter and our discussion. First, the sense of self is not a single location, a physical object, or a homunculus. It is an autopoietic construction generated through distributed dynamical brain networks, specifically the inactive phenomenological, narrative, and frontoparietal control networks. Second, the default mode network, the DMN, is the primary engine of the narrative, autobiographical self. It is the time-traveling storyteller. Third, predictive coding, specifically the mechanism of corollary discharge, is the fundamental computational algorithm by which the brain differentiates me from not me.
Fourth, psychiatric and neurological disruptions, whether it's the terrifying thought insertion seen in schizophrenia or the bizarre denial of ownership in anosognosia, prove clinically that the self is modular and can physically fragment. Fifth, because the self is a construction, it is inherently dynamic and malleable. Novel therapeutic interventions, from rigorous mindfulness to psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, target these exact network architectures to dissolve maladaptive rigidity. And finally, the overarching lesson for any clinician is that psychiatry cannot rely purely on objective biology. It must engage deeply and empathetically with the subjective, phenomenological experience of the patient.
Excellent. Now, to truly cement these concepts and test our clinical reasoning, we are going to run through a brief thought experiment game based on single best answer clinical questions. I will pose a scenario or a specific mechanistic question to you, the listener. I want you to mentally lock in your answer, and then our expert will break down the clinical rationale. Question 1. You have a patient who is trapped in severe depressive rumination. They sit for hours lost in negative autobiographical thoughts, completely disengaged from the present moment. Which brain network is most heavily implicated in constructing this narrative self and is characteristically hyperactive during this kind of mind wandering?
The answer is the default mode network, or DMN, specifically involving the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the VMPFC, and the posterior cingulate cortex, the PCC. Clinically, hyperconnectivity in this network prevents the patient from toggling back to external sensory reality, trapping them in the internal narrative.
Question 2. A patient presents to the psychiatric emergency room with acute schizophrenia. They are highly distressed, reporting that foreign thoughts are being placed directly into their head by a government agency. This profound deficit in distinguishing self-generated internal speech from external voices is best explained as a failure in what specific neurobiological mechanism?
The answer is feed-forward prediction and corollary discharge signals, fundamentally understood through the comparator model. When the cognitive command for inner speech is generated without the parallel predictive signal reaching the sensory cortex, the brain registers its own thought as an unpredicted, alien event, manifesting as the delusion of thought insertion.
Question 3. Shifting to developmental psychology. You are using psychodynamic psychotherapy to treat a patient with profound narcissistic vulnerability and unstable self-esteem. According to Heinz Kohut's self-psychology, you suspect a failure in their early childhood environment. What are the 3 essential functions provided by self-objects that this patient likely lacked?
The answer is mirroring, idealizing, and twinship. These are the critical external psychological functions provided by healthy caregivers that allow a developing child to internalize a cohesive, resilient sense of self-worth and belonging.
Question 4. Let's look at the philosophy of agency. In Benjamin Libet's classic, highly debated experiment regarding voluntary action, what was the exact chronological relationship discovered between physical brain activity and the subject's conscious awareness of their intention to move?
The answer is that the EEG readiness potentials preceded the conscious urge to move by several hundred milliseconds. The motor cortex began preparing the action significantly before the subject's conscious eye registered the decision, challenging intuitive notions of absolute free will.
Question 5. You are comparing the neuroanatomy of humans to that of lower mammals. Which unique, specialized class of neurons found predominantly in the anterior insular cortex and anterior cingulate cortex are uniquely associated with rapid social intuition, empathy, and self-reflective awareness in primates?
The answer is von Economo neurons, also known as spindle neurons. Their large size and streamlined morphology allow for the extremely rapid integration between complex frontal social cognition and deep homeostatic bodily states.
Question 6, our final scenario. You are reviewing the pharmacological mechanisms of novel therapeutics. Classic tryptamine psychedelics like psilocybin exert profound effects on self-representation, driving network entropy and ego dissolution. They achieve this primarily through agonism at which specific receptor target?
The answer is the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor. Activation of these receptors, which are densely located on the apical dendrites of layer 5 pyramidal cells, radically increases neuroplasticity and decreases the modular boundaries of networks like the DMN, allowing for therapeutic reorganization.
Fantastic. We have deconstructed the self from the 17th century philosophy of Descartes all the way down to the dendritic branching of a 5-HT2A receptor. I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. We started this deep dive looking for a solid pearl inside the oyster of the skull, and instead we found a symphony without a conductor. But if your self is ultimately a biological output, an autopoietic construction that completely rebuilds its network states depending on who you're talking to, what environment you're in, or what medicine you have taken, then maybe self isn't a noun at all. Maybe it shouldn't be a person, place, or thing. Maybe it is a verb. You aren't a person. You are a continuous, dynamic act of personing.
It is a profound shift in perspective, and one that is essential for modern psychiatric practice. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the mind's most intricate construction.
Thank you for listening to this deep dive. Here are the details of this episode.
Neuropsychiatry of self. Byline. The constructed I, how the brain generates identity, continuity, and subjective experience.